least impressive thing about me is that I'm a lawyer. Good afternoon, welcome to Marxism. I hope you're finding it interesting, informing, educative, and inspiring us to go out and fight for a better world. So, why is crime racialised? Well, actually, before I even consider that particular question, there are a couple of other questions that I think I need to address to put things in context. Firstly, what is crime? Now, you might think that given that I've been actually a practicing criminal barrister for 15 years, I ought to be able to answer that question relatively easily. And you might think as well that there are some obvious examples, non-consensual sexual violation of another person's body, rape, sexual assault and such like, though the appalling rate and outcome at which these things are dealt with by the police and prosecuting authorities has led many people, many victims, to consider that the likes of rape have been effectively decriminalised. But I'm sure we can all agree that's criminal. Unprovoked violence, another seemingly obvious example, theft, robbery, and the like. But what about, now I'm sure many people here will have been enjoying the incredibly hot weather we've been having over the last few days or so, but nevertheless you may well think that that weather is the consequence of the catastrophic climate change that we are experiencing across the world, and yet the people responsible for that catastrophe continue to profit at an extortionate rate, whilst the people who campaign and protest against it are criminalised, dragged through the courts. I have represented clients who, organisations such as Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil, who are not only being dragged through the courts, prosecuted, convicted and imprisoned, they are being told when they're dragged through the courts that they are not even allowed to mention the term climate change, because if they do, not only will they be prosecuted for the crime of, for example, causing a public nuisance by blocking roads, motorways and the like, they will also be held in contempt of court and further punished for simply mentioning climate change. So, who's criminal there? Well, what about, exactly 2 weeks ago, friends and comrades commemorate, the families, the bereaved survivors and community members in the Grenfell Tower area commemorated the 8th anniversary of that fire. I remember being there in the immediate aftermath of the fire and hearing the harrowing stories of people who had lost loved ones, and they were saying then that their loved ones had been murdered, and they wanted the people responsible to be held accountable for corporate murder, as they called it. 8 years down the line, and we know it's been uncovered the way in which the council, various contractors and so on, lied and covered up the reality of what they had done to Grenfell Tower, and are clearly culpable for the deaths of those people, and yet, certainly to date, no prosecutions. Or a couple of other highly topical matters. What about music artists, such as Kneecap or Bob Dylan, making political declarations on stage? Indeed, the brilliant children's writer Michael Rosen was at Glastonbury last weekend, and he compared what Bob Dylan said on stage with what Bob Dylan said on stage at Glastonbury in 1998 when he performed his brilliant song Masters of War. You haven't heard it? Google Bob Dylan singing Masters of War and compare what he said to what Bob Dylan said. Was that really incitement to violence? And actually, whilst we think about it, there are posters here to our brilliant young comrade Kwabena Devonish, who faces terrorism charges as the likes of Kneecap and potentially Bob Dylan do. And of course, let's consider the decision only this week by Parliament to prescribe the group Palestine Action as a terrorist organisation. for supposedly, occupying factories and causing criminal damage and so on. And of course, actually, whilst we are at it, looking more broadly on the international scale, given the reasons why Palestine Action did what they did and have been prescribed as they have, what about Israel dropping bombs on, as they did this week, on a cafe, killing 120 men, women and children who were seeking respite from the relentless bombardment that they have experienced over the last couple of years. Now, what I want you to do is keep those things in mind, because if you think about it, the answer to the question that is raised here today, you can, if you think about it, it gives you the answer to that question. Anyway, what does racialised mean? And crime racialised? It means, the suggestion is that people from black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds are disproportionately targeted and negatively impacted by what you might euphemistically call the criminal justice system. Now, if that is the case, then there is a very real problem for those who govern and rule us, isn't there? Because there is supposed to be an unwritten social contract between our rulers and those who are ruled, at the heart of which are a couple of key principles. One is that we are all equal before the law, and another is that the police, whose day job is, of course, supposedly to ensure law and order, that they operate by consent, regardless of whether or not we like the police, like a particular police that we have, want to be police. We are meant to accept them, because otherwise society would be in danger of breaking down into supposed Hobbesian war of all against all. For those of you who know and want your bit of Latin, velum omnium contra omnes supposedly would persist. So is it true that crime is racialised? And here what I want to do is I want to take you back a few months, because you may not recall, some of you will, but most of you probably won't, understandably recall. But back then, there was what may seem like a relatively obscure row between the Justice Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, and an organisation, again, most of you have probably never heard of, the Sentencing Council. And in short, the Sentencing Council is a so-called independent, non-departmental body, which is part of the Ministry of Justice's family of arm's length bodies. That's how they describe themselves. Still with me? Yeah? Okay. Its primary role is to issue guidelines on criminal sentencing which judges must follow, unless, having considered everything, they decide that it's not in the interest of justice to follow those guidelines. Now, as part of its remit, as long ago as 2022, the Sentencing Council had drafted proposals suggesting that background reports, called pre-sentence reports, should normally, not always, but normally, be ordered by judges before sentencing people from certain religious and ethnic backgrounds. Now, back then, 2022, neither of the major political parties objected to those proposals. March the 6th, fast forward to March the 6th of this year, and Mahmood wrote a letter to the Sentencing Council in which he said that I must make it clear my displeasure at the direction that this guideline took in recommending differing approaches for those from ethnic minorities, cultural minorities, and or from faith or minority backgrounds. She recognised pre-sentence reports can help courts, but argued that access to them should not be determined by an offender's ethnicity, culture, or religion. And ultimately, actually, she forced them to back down and abandon that proposal. This was a totally disingenuous intervention and a concession to the culture wars promoted quite specifically in that case by her Tory opponent, Robert Jenrick, and lurking behind them the likes of Reform UK or sinister forces like Stephen Yaxley Lennon and so on. Mahmood ought to know that crime is racialised. Her boss, Keir Starmer, who you recall, before becoming Prime Minister, before becoming an MP, was the chief prosecutor in England and Wales, the director of public prosecutions. He certainly ought to know. One person who very definitely did know, was her cabinet colleague, the Foreign Secretary David Lammy. Why do I say that? Because back in 2017, David Lammy published and linked his name to an official report, the Lammy Review, commissioned by the then Tory government, that clearly set out the differential outcome that people from black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds have at the hands of the police and the wider criminal justice system. And as fast forwarding today, as the Institute of Race Relations, in a very useful report published in September of last year, made it clear, black, Asian and minority ethnic communities are overrepresented at almost all stages of the criminal justice process, disproportionately targeted by the police, more likely to be imprisoned and to receive longer sentences than white people. Now, I don't want to bombard you with statistics and facts, but a few are necessary just to highlight the extent of the disproportionality. Stop and search was not even covered by Lammy in his review. There was another report which came out at the time that made clear the disproportionality in stop and search. But on that particular issue, between 2019 and 21, in England and Wales, and I'm not going to go into the different divisions of ethnic groups that there was. I'm just going to use the points that were raised in the report. There were 52.6 stops for every 1,000 black people, compared to 7.5 for every per 1,000 of every white person. In the last year, according to an organisation called Stopwatch, black people were 9 times more likely than white people to be stopped for drugs possession, despite having a lower rate of drugs use than white people. Here in London, the most ethnically diverse part of the country, there were 69 stops per 1,000 black people, compared to 28.8 in the rest of the country. That's indication of what happens here. And a report in February 2023 showed that at one point, more intimate searches, strip searches, the 55% of intimate strip searches were of black people. And some of you will recall, I'm sure, the horrific case, which was back in the news this week actually, of a 15-year-old girl, Child Q, in Hackney, this borough, who was strip searched at school whilst menstruating in 2020. And a report carried out after that particular atrocity showed that black children are 11 times more likely to be strip searched in England and Wales than white people. I could spend my entire time talking about the ineffectiveness of stop and search as a crime prevention mechanism. I'll just leave you with the statistic that 77% of cases between 2020 and 2021, in 77% of cases, no further action was taken beyond that single interaction, stop and search. Now, as I indicated, Lammy didn't mention stop and search in his report, but overall his conclusion was that black, Asian and minority ethnic people still face bias, including over discrimination in parts of the justice system. To be honest, it's a rather timid conclusion, given that at the outset he noted this, and I quote, that despite making up just 14% of the population, Black, Asian, minority ethnic men and women make up 25%, a quarter of prisoners, whilst over 40% of young people in custody are for Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds. He added, if our prison population reflected the makeup of England and Wales, we would have 9,000 fewer people in prison, the equivalent of 12 average-sized prisons. And, get this, there is a greater disproportionality in the number of black people in prisons here than in the United States. I don't know whether that's still the case, that was in 2017, but nevertheless, the fact that that was the case then is, and I would argue, astonishing figure. So the plain truth is that beyond stops and searches, many of which, as I say, lead to nothing but anger and resentment, Black, Asian and minority ethnic people are far more likely to be arrested, to be charged with more serious offences, if convicted, more likely to be given a custodial sentence, sent to prison, and if given a prison sentence, more likely to be sentenced for longer. More widely, research by brilliant organisations like Inquest highlight the fact that continuing hugely disproportionate deaths in police and prison custody of people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds. And I'll just pause here to plug the book by the brilliant campaigner Janet Alder, which documents what injustice that her family suffered, both in the death of her brother Christopher and the continuing injustice that they faced and experienced decades after Christopher's death. So the suggestion that crime is racialised cannot seriously be contested, I would argue. And furthermore, as that one word, steal, in Lammy's timid conclusion suggests, it's nothing new. It certainly dates back to the period, at least, of sizable immigration that occurred in the aftermath of the Second World War. So, you know, the post-Windrush period, if I can put it that way. So, for example, back in 1966, there was a report by the West Indian Standing Conference, the author of which was a man called Joseph Hutton. I apologise for the term, but the title of the report was Nigger Hunting in England. And the author, talking about the area that Sam and I operate in, Brixton, he said in his report that for 7 years I've been residing in Brixton, I have been constantly besieged by members of the immigrant population with matters of conflict between them and members of the police force. That report actually is quoted by Darcus Howe in this publication, From Bobby to Babylon, Blacks in the British Police, which is a series of essays which charts the way in which the relationship between black communities and the police consistently have been challenging and broken down in the post-Windrush period. Howe himself, a direct victim of that. I probably don't have time. How long have I got, Sam?
11 minutes.
11 minutes. I haven't got time to go into the whole experience of the Mangrove Nine, but I would suggest, if you can, probably still on BBC iPlayer, you can see the film made a few years ago by the director Steve McQueen that charts the way in which Darcus Howe, Frank Critchlow, Barbara Beese and a number of others had to represented themselves at court in a notorious case in the early 70s against police harassment, bullying and attempts to fit them up for very serious offences. And next year will mark the 50th anniversary of events at Notting Hill Carnival. Giving my age away here a little bit, the first carnival that I ever attended, where quite literally the police waded in and attacked people who attended. Ever since then, the police have specifically targeted the carnival, attempted to present it as a carnival of violence, if you like. Again, something that Harold talks about at length in the book. So these things aren't new. The racialisation of crime is nothing new. It did appear, however, as if we had reached a watershed in 1999 with the publication of the Stephen Lawrence Inquiry report by a retired Judge Sir William Macpherson. The report itself was into the botched murder investigation of a black teenager, Stephen Lawrence, back in 1993, which actually highlighted the fact that black communities are under-policed as victims of crime, but over-policed as alleged perpetrators. What was important about that report was that it led to an official acknowledgement of something that black communities had been arguing for decades, that racism is not simply about the attitudes and behaviours of individual people, individual police officers, individual encounters, but rather it is structural, it is institutional, it is baked into the way in which the police and other institutions operate. Now, before coming on to the question of why it's the case, I want to add a point which is actually well made by a friend and comrade of mine, Ken Allende, in a chapter that he's written in this book, No Justice, No Police, by another friend actually, edited by another friend, Matt Clement. What Ken argues, I think very persuasively, is not simply that historically crime has been racialised in a general sense. It certainly has. But what he argues is that, furthermore, there are particular circumstances and periods when it is quite consciously and specifically ramped up. So, for example, as argued by the, officially you would call it, Stuart Hall, Professor Stuart Hall, in a highly influential publication in the 1970s called Policing the Crisis. The concept of mugging has no actual basis in law, was very consciously played up by the authorities. This was a very specifically racialised assertion that young black men and youth were indulging in widespread and opportunistic street robbery. And it became, amongst other things, the rationale for initiatives such as Operation Swamp, the police invasion into Brixton, which led to the 1981 riot, or uprising as I prefer to call it. A more recent example is what I would characterise as the demonisation of Asian and in particular Muslim communities. We saw this in the late 1980s after the row caused by the publication of Salman Rushdie's novel The Satanic Verses, but it was turbocharged in the aftermath of the 9/11 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center in New York. Here in Britain, it led very specifically to the abandonment of any of the kind of anti-racist notions and initiatives that had begun to develop in the aftermath of the publication of the Stephen Lawrence Inquiry report in 1999. The then Prime Minister, Tony Blair, explicitly said, after 9/11, the rules of the game have changed. And in so doing, he gave carte blanche to the police to go back on the offensive in terms of stop and search, and particularly to target Asian and Muslim communities with the same degree of hostility and determination that they had previously targeted African and Caribbean communities. So, why is crime racialised? We shouldn't be surprised that crime is racialised, because, and here, if you like, is my answer to the overall question. It fits into a wider framework in which a society that we live is divided, unequal, and for the overwhelming majority, oppressive and exploitative. A tiny minority at the top benefit to obscene levels, and they need to use whatever mechanisms they can to maintain their power and control over the overwhelming majority of the rest of us. It is, in short, a consequence of the deeply alienating society and divisive society in which we live. Now, I don't view things through rose-tinted spectacles. It's certainly the case that much of what we would regard as crime that does occur is carried out by working class people. And let me be open and honest about this. A huge, and Comrade Dean Ryan, who's here, who's been a youth worker for many years, can confirm this. A huge proportion, probably, like, because I operate mostly in London, a huge proportion of the people I've represented in my 15 years have been from black, Asian and minority backgrounds. And some of them have done truly horrific things to other people from the same backgrounds. It's also the case, a huge majority that I represent from whatever background, marginalisation and exclusion. None of that should be a surprise. My argument is that these things don't happen simply because these people are bad, criminally inclined. It's primarily because of the deeply divisive and alienating society in which we live. Our rulers have an interest in deflecting the blame from themselves for the huge oceans of misery and deprivation and alienation that exist. They have an interest in doing that. Since the advent of capitalism, racism has been one of the primary means by which they've done that, by which they've sought to divide our side, ordinary people, the better to ensure that they can maintain their rule. And therefore they use whatever means at their disposal to reinforce it. The newspapers, TV, I mean, how many, turn on the TV, how many programs are about crime? Trying to instill the notion that there's so much crime that we must have the police, we must have the courts, we must do something about it. I want to conclude with 4 points. Firstly, it follows that the analysis that I put forward is not just about the police. People use the term, all the cops are bastards and have a go at the police. Completely understandable, but it's not just about individual police officers or about the police. It's about the entire system, the courts, Parliament, the way in which we are. And remember, it's Parliament last week by a huge majority that has decided to prescribe Palestine action. Secondly, although my analysis has been focused on the UK, it's the country I live in, that I know most about, the points that I'm making are universal ones, equally applicable to France, Italy, the United States, or wherever. Thirdly, whilst people from black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds suffer disproportionately, we do not suffer exclusively. In places like Britain, the majority of people who suffer at the hands of the police and the court system and so on, are from white and working class backgrounds. So we have a common interest in coming together to fight against that oppression and so on. And my final point is this, that, and in a sense it's not inevitable that the ruling class can succeed forever. Remember, Black Lives Matter, just 5 years ago. That upsurge occurred precisely because people across the world, in their tens of millions, could see the injustice that occurred and identified with it. It wasn't simply sympathy for George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and people like that in the United States, but it was a rage against the injustices that we experience and witness here in our towns and cities as well. And that point is critically important for socialists because we argue that people are not simply empty vessels into which the ideas of the ruling class are poured and retained. People also learn critically from their own experiences, and crucially, their ideas can change in struggle. So yes, crime is racialised. It's racialised because our rulers need to racialise it. They need to other people. They need to do these things in order to try and keep our side divided. It's not guaranteed that they can succeed. The challenge is to ensure that they don't succeed and to ensure that wonderful upsurges like Black Lives Matter are not simply moments of great exhilaration, but ultimately can become movements for lasting change. Thanks very much.